Risk management is at the heart of what we do. Our deep-rooted industry and technical expertise enables us to manage the unique risks your business faces.
It's been labelled the COVID-19 effect, that being the changes that all industries are having to tackle because of the pandemic. So how has COVID-19 impacted the risk landscape? To find out on this episode of The Role of Insurance, brought to you by Santam Specialist Insurance, I'm joined by Gareth Beaver, CEO of SHA Risk Specialists, a member of the Santam Insurance Group, and Yuri Arvi, the CEO of GIB Group as well. Gents, thanks so much for your time today. So let's start off right at the top and perhaps take a step back, because to contextualize this discussion, it really is a discussion about the economy as well. Gareth, in your opinion, are we in an economic crisis here?
Bronwyn, yes, absolutely. I think that's agreed amongst everyone around the world, from politicians to business people. So sadly, the lockdowns that have ensued to try and manage and flatten the curve clearly has just stopped all momentum in the economies. We're all interconnected globally, and so a huge knock-on effect. And we can see it. The headline numbers in terms of growth or negative growth in the 2 quarters of 2020 have been numbers that have not been seen since the Great Depression. So yes, without a doubt, a huge economic crisis we're in, and we're still going through it. So for sure.
And it's likely to be here for quite a while. And what that economic crisis does mean is job losses. Yuri, you interface with clients on a daily basis, with businesses on a daily basis. How top of mind is retrenchment for businesses?
Maybe before I comment on retrenchments, thanks, Bronwyn, maybe just to pick up on Gareth's comment. I recently came across just some numbers, from the IMF that really puts it into perspective. This is to your question, are we, in an economic crisis? And it's forecasted that the impact to global GDP by 2021 will be in the region of $12 trillion US, fairly large number. But if you compare that to the loss during the financial crisis in 2008, that led to a $2 trillion US loss. So I think it's 12 trillion versus 2 trillion. I think sums it up for me. And then the final comment on that as well, the more recent World Economic Forum post-COVID report that came out in May, ranks, through their research, prolonged recession of the global economy as the #1 most likely fallout for the world and the globe. So I think no doubt, as Gareth said, that things will be pretty tough out there. And then just very briefly to your question on retrenchments, I think, as an intermediary, we do engage, at various levels in organizations, and I think it differs. I think pleased to say that there are organizations that appear to be weathering the storm, but on the other hand, there are many, that obviously need to take drastic action, including downsizing in their organizations. So certainly that is also a reality out there that impacts our industry, and business at large.
Yes, so the picture out there is pretty dire, and then what that could lead to is desperate employees, desperate businesses, and that's just the perfect mix for desperate times, calling for desperate measures. And then, in that context, elevated risk, right? So Gareth, from where you sit, from a risk perspective, what areas are key? Where are you seeing the elevated risk come through?
Yeah, so I think the risk landscape is extremely wide, and it'll impact many areas of the economy and companies. We can narrow this down a little bit from our perspective, where we come from in terms of the insurance solutions that we offer. But one of the big underlying sort of common denominators is going to be where in desperate times breed desperate measures. And I think the temptation for individuals, people, humans, from employees at all levels to crime syndicates, crime is going to be a common theme, fraud, crime. Because when people are on the back foot, what do? As I say, their temptation to steal rises dramatically. And so, across many elements of running a business, your businesses are going to be exposed to this massively increased criminal and fraudulent impact. So from cybercrime, so cyber criminals looking to affect cyber crimes for money, extortion, bribery. Within a business, employees who are in charge of your stock, your assets, your goods, your money, your etc., are going to be either themselves tempted to put their hands in the till, or they could be targeted very much by the outside. So criminal syndicates who go after them and literally put a gun to the head and say, right, you're going to be part of a crime here, or else, you can say goodbye. So that's going to be a common theme that's going to run a lot. And then, of course, there'll be the direct impact of employee health and wellness. When people come to work and they're under severe pressure, that pressure might be as a result of taking salary cuts or seeing some of their colleagues being retrenched, or even just family members, extended family members, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, etc., losing their jobs. So they might be okay in their job, but their brother or sister works for another business that got hugely impacted, creates a huge amount of mental stress. They come to work, they're distracted, they're not engaged. That's often when accidents happen, because they're not focused on doing the job correctly, particularly in industries where, it's heavy manufacturing, mining, engineering, etc. So an increased risk of employee accidents. And so, those are some of the key things that we see the risk thermometer going up significantly for businesses.
Okay, so before we delve into the detail on some of those risks, Yuri, how cognizant are businesses of these increased risks that are out there?
Bronwyn, I'd like to believe that businesses are very aware, of the risks, and obviously it's also, intermediaries and risk advisors that need to play a role in making sure that the right discussions being had at C-suite level and throughout the organization. I think a challenge that we do see out there is, organizations' ability to respond, through their risk management initiatives, to all these challenges. Obviously, it needs to be about prioritizing, but it also implies that, that you need to have funds available, CapEx expenditure, etc., to deal with some of these risk mitigating requirements. And I think that is quite a sensitive balance at this point in time, considering that, the state that the economy is in. How do you balance your risk spend or risk mitigating spend with, whilst a business is perhaps not functioning, at full throttle. So I think that is a theme that we will see, running on for a while to come. But certainly, I think there's a great level of awareness around risk, generally speaking.
Because, like you highlight there, Yuri, it's costly to deal with these things. I picked up some statistics that said that the investigation into what has happened can actually be more than the liability that has to be carried, right, Gareth?
Correct, yes. In particular, where we've seen and we've been involved in writing commercial crime or fidelity guarantee insurance for a number of years. We're now obviously going to go into a period of time where that risk is going to spike substantially. But over the years, very often just the investigative cost of establishing and proving and proving a claim of fraud can run into sometimes almost the same cost of the actual fraud perpetuated against the organization itself. You have to bring in forensic auditors, specialist investigators. You have to go back, imagine trying to go back and unpack 10 years worth of record keeping, and it's very expensive. So very often, the fraud might be 20 million rand or more, and the cost of just investigating and proving an insurance claim becomes a big number. So, and that is just then becomes part of the insurance claim, and very often leaves the person staring two losses. The actual cost of the fraud plus the cost of investigation. So very expensive for businesses.
And that's why mitigation is so important, right? Because that's effectively what's going to guard against some of these things coming to the fore. So let's dive into some of the detail on some of the areas that have been identified where there could be increased risk. And let's start with public liability, but from an employee perspective, because we kind of touched on it here and there, but let's dig into it a little bit, because like you say, employees can be under quite a lot of stress. They can be cash strapped. They're perhaps looking at innovative ways, if we can put it that way, to generate money, and they can do that by running scams perhaps at their places of work. Gareth, how does that play out for you? What are some of the things that employees could do at a workplace that businesses would need to be aware of?
Yeah, so just looking at the area of liability insurance, public liability insurance, as you termed it. So very often there, it's not only your employees, but in fact some of your most respected customers. So take a retailer where the customers come in, and then all of a sudden, they're walking down a corridor, and they invent or create a slip and trip scenario. So they may have been suffering. They may have been suffering with some sort of injury prior to this, and they now need to come up with money to go into a hospital or see a specialist surgeon, and they don't have the money. They've lost their job. They're under financial pressure. All of a sudden, your organization becomes the target of that individual, where next thing they're pitching up and saying, no, they walk down a corridor, the cleaners had just cleaned there, they hadn't put up the right sort of cautionary signs, and they slip, trip, and then present and say, look, here, look at these injuries. And of course, they're looking to really extort your money. Now, very often you would go into a detailed investigation. You may have CCTV cameras to look and see that, but very often companies' brands, with social media today, it's so easy for any individual, a man in the street, to bring pressure to a brand through a social media campaign. It's quite cheap for them to do that. And so there might be pressure under to just now make a settlement and make this thing go away, rather than have your brand taken out and exposed and challenged in the court of public opinion. So we tend to see in difficult times companies and outsiders as customers coming in and creating these kind of events, wanting to take money from you as a business.
I mean, it does sound crazy and it sounds far-fetched that people would sit at home and think of doing these things, but it does speak to desperate times calling for desperate measures. And these things then do happen, right, Yuri?
No, absolutely. I also think one must just, again, to give some perspective, I do not believe that employee fraud is as a result, or has arisen as a result of COVID-19. Sadly, as we know, fraud is really systematic of our socio-economic environment. But certainly, I mean, I think to go to this point, being exacerbated by the financial stress that has been brought about as a result of COVID-19. And I think added to that, again, sadly so, there is a level, or there's a culture perhaps of impunity stemming from, from the top, perhaps politically and otherwise, where insurance fraud is not seen or is not seen as benign, and it's not seen to be harming anyone. And that is that obviously is pretty scary. But I think again that's sort of the dark side of it. I think again from a risk advisory and a risk management consultancy advice point of view, there are measures that can be taken, to mitigate. I think a lot of that will talk to people management. I think a theme that's coming through here, time and again, looking at your processes, your procedures, and bringing people into the organization, wide of just your normal checks and balances. But it is an area I think that will be under the limelight for some time to come. If I may just here, Bronwyn, you very briefly asked Gareth to comment on some emerging risks, and he touched on cyber. And if I just made just a few observations, and I fully agree that cyber is certainly one of the foremost emerging risks, directly driven and impacted by COVID-19. As organizations really started operating on different platforms. There's also been a lot of cyber crime in terms of third parties actually through using the COVID, the sentiments around COVID to create false sites, etc., to siphon money of governments and organizations. So that's the one side of it. I think the other part is really to link it with the responsibility of directors and officers. Leadership teams today have lots to apply their mind to, but I think one of the key areas emanating out of this pandemic is really to be reminded of the significant responsibility that the boards typically have in an organization, by virtue also of King 4, requirements, etc. And it really boils down to things like, leadership needs to have line of sight and make the right decisions to make sure there's adequate cyber protection in place. There needs to be a disaster recovery plan in place. And these are sort of fairly large tasks, historically probably more in the domain of the IT department or the chief information officer, but this has really overnight become very much in the domain and responsibility of C-suite and leadership, and it's an onerous requirement. So I think this is something that leaders in business, I know they are paying attention to it, but need to continue to do so, because there could be liabilities attaching to oversight or mistakes that made in that regard.
Okay, let's hit pause there. We're going to head into a short break, and we'll pick up on cybercrime when we come back. There's more after this, so stay with us.
33 countries, 75 innovative risk solutions, over 100 years of experience. It all adds up to being the largest general insurer in Africa.